So we're going to start with a talk from Dr. Amena Smith and Smith-Fine and Jen Keller from KKI. They're going to be talking about wearable sensors to assess sensory motor function in AMN.
Today, what we're going to tell you a little bit about are sensory motor measures that are important in AMN, and that information is going to come from some of our historical studies as well as from our longitudinal data from the LO study. And then I'm going to introduce for you some wearables that are how they're being used in clinical research, and then we're going to talk about how we are using them now to begin studying their use in AMN. So from physical activity to measuring balance and gait. I'm going to skip over the summary of AMN for you all, but we are talking about adults with AMN in this situation, both men and women. For some time now, we have focused on quantifying sensory motor measures in AMN because the clinical measures that we can get are just not sensitive enough to assess the disease severity, like how weak someone might be, or how impaired balance or walking is. And so we started with looking at strength using a handheld dynamometer, and it's a small device that we look mostly at hip strength. And so in this picture, you can see that the tester is putting it on near the knee of the subject, and they're resisting the pressure, and we can get a reading in pounds or kilograms for how much force the hip flexor in this case is able to generate. We also have been interested in looking at vibration sensation. For this, we use a vibratron, which gives two poles that one vibrates at a time. And looking at the sensation at the great toe, we try and find the threshold at which someone can still feel vibration and where they can't. This is important, particularly because vibration sensation is it's a sort of a marker for proprioception, which is knowing where your body is in space. And so it could be important for keeping your balance or being more coordinated in your walking. In addition to that, we look at balance. And so in the lab, we use force plates. They're embedded in the ground and they don't move, but they're very sensitive and pick up how much you sway. So when you stand still, everyone sways. But when you lose, say, proprioception or that vibration sensation, you tend to sway more. And so this is a way for us to measure more I would say with a little bit less bias. I can get you to have more strength if I cheer for you, but to try and have you stand still and not sway so much, there's a little bit less bias in the measure, which gives us a quantitative measure. And we can look at your standing balance similarly to the way we look in the clinic, standing with your feet apart and your eyes open. Can you do that for 30 seconds? To closing your eyes or narrowing your base of support by putting your feet together. And then finally, in the motion lab, we study walking, sometimes with 3D motion capture with markers at the different joints, and have you walk in the lab at self-selected walking or fast walking. We also just do timed walking tests, like how quickly can you walk, or how big are your steps, or how fast do you take a step. And so these are what we've studied for some time now. And what we found is that there are significant impairments and functional measures to look at in AMN. And we can find from lower extremity strength that it's associated with cortical spinal tract loss. And we also can use it as a way to kind of group severity from like mild to severe. So if you can take some resistance with the dynamometer, then that tells us that you're mildly impaired, but your strength may be so much more impaired that you can only move without gravity. So like, say, laying on your side. So it kind of gives us a range, but it gives us a more fine measure from mild to severe symptoms. And then with vibration sensation, as I said, it has been shown to correlate well with dorsal column or tract loss in AMN as well. And it is correlated with our activity and participation measures. So those are the standing balance and the walking measures. And so it's a good link between, both these measures are kind of a good link between the pathology that we know is involved in AMN as well as with what occurs in functions like balance and walking and participating in life. So for the sway amplitude that I talked about for balance measure, this is impaired in both men and women with AMN. And it's related to hip strength and to walking as well. And it's relevant, it's been shown to be relevant for slower walking as well as for disability, so like how severe symptoms are overall. And then walking is a functional measure that is really used broadly. Obviously, people usually often first talk about, their walking becomes more difficult, and it's also usually a prime goal of patients with AMN is to walk better. So it's been for a long time considered a primary impairment in AMN. So this year, we were finally able to publish the results of this Lorenzo's oil study, looking at these measures over 2 years in 148 individuals. So about 40% of them were men, and we were able to find, to show that the sensory motor outcomes do show progression in that 2-year period, which is improvement over a number of our measures, particularly like the EDSS, which measures overall disability, in order to be more sensitive and pick up change earlier. So I just want to show you some of those results. So for hip flexion strength, you can see that it declined over 2 years for both men and women. I'll have a few of these graphs, but along the x-axis, you can see the months from 0 to 24 months, and then on the y-axis is the hip flexion strength. So men are shown in red, and women are shown in red and men are shown in blue, I'm sorry. And you can just see that the decline is similar over the 2-year period. For sensation and walking, we found that for the whole group, for men and women, it worsened over the 2 years, but not selectively for one group or the other. Worse sensation is having a higher threshold at which you are unable to feel, so that's why the worse is going in the upward direction. And then for walking, we actually found that it was more significant for men, that while women declined minimally over 2 years, the walking speed declined more significantly for men. And then for standing postural sway, so this is to give you an idea of what it looks like. The trace on the left here is a man at the baseline function, and you can see how much sway there is over the 30-second period. So that's kind of the tracing of where their center of pressure went over that time period. And then 2 years later, how much more sway. You can just get a good visual picture of what that looks like. And you can see that for both men and women, standing with their eyes open and their feet apart, that's what the abbreviation stands for, that there is a similar amount of sway at baseline and that it declines similarly and significantly in 2 years. So for on the left, I'm showing you the same graph that I just did for the eyes open, feet apart, only now we've had people move their feet together. So we've narrowed their base of support, and you can see that men and women show similar, worsening, increased sway. We expect you to have a little bit more sway because it's a more challenging posture, and that it declines similarly over 2 years in both groups. What's interesting is when we have people close their eyes, what you can see here on the right is that for men, their sway increases significantly more. Just at baseline, although both decline over time. And that could be related to having worse sensation or just indicates that this balance condition is much more difficult for men than it is for women with AMN. So it's good for us to find that these measures are not only changed significantly over 2 years, which does shorten our period that we're able to monitor for functional change and then evaluate potential treatments, but also that they can be selective so that we can pick up differences between men and women and look for something, maybe look for important changes both in research, but also just clinically in order to give better advice from a rehab perspective. And so one thing about these measures is that they require you to be in person, and they often require expensive equipment. And so we are interested, as everyone else is, in accelerometry or wearables, because it does allow us to look at movement in a real world context, which may have more meaning to you, how you participate in your life. And then it's also a little bit cheaper and a little bit easier to use. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about how it's being used. I mean, everyone, I think, at this point has a Fitbit or type device that tells you how many steps you take per day. But there are also research-grade devices like the Actigraph and then the Opals, which are made by APDM, which allow us to have access to the raw data, and they're FDA approved. And so we're able to look more specifically at activity rather than just like step counts from Fitbit, which may not allow us to have access to their raw data. And these have been being used now for some time in a lot of different populations. There are large data sets on aging. I've looked at different factors that impact aging and activity. We've also looked at it in MS to assess looking at like disability and sleep patterns, as well as rehabilitation outcome measures. In cardiology, they've looked at do you see a change in people's activity pre and post surgery, and then mood disorders as well. So there's a lot of use out there and experience from which to build. You probably know a little bit about how they work, but they are like a watch, basically, that can be worn on the wrists or the ankles or at the waist. And they give us information in 3 dimensions about movement. So it's acceleration information that we get. It's collected typically around 100 hertz. And I'm just going to show you here in this video, the student is wearing accelerometers on her wrists and on her ankles. And the top tracing is her right wrist, and the right ankle is below that. And so that you'll see when she's doing different activities how we get different information from the devices. And so you can, and when she's walking, you see more activity coming in the bottom tracing for her foot activity. And you can see how you can pick up that sort of regular cyclical motion of the right foot and the left foot. And then when she's swinging her arms, you can tell that she's initiated some motion in her arms. And then when she stands still, you can see there's not really any activity in the leg accelerometers, but in her wrists, you can tell that she's doing dressing. And so with non-trivial statistical analysis, you can look at different features of movement. And so I don't know, like I think we all think about steps counts, but there's other ways to look at activity. And so there's like an end range of looking at your daily activity over 24 hours, what kind of sleep you're getting, when you're getting your highest amount of activity during the day, all the way down to we're actually able to look at sway and walking qualities like I talked about from the lab data. So Dr. Smith-Fine and I are going to talk about how we're using accelerometry now in AMN, and we're using 2 different methods from each end of that spectrum of summary, physical activity summary. So for one way we're interested in looking in that is the overall daily activity patterns and how those might relate to disability overall, as well as like impairments like strength and sensation, and then to balance and walking. And in the current study, what we're doing is looking longitudinally at men and women. Every 6 months, we're going to collect activity for 14 days. And we're going to compare that to measures of the neurological exam, the strength and sensation measures, the walking, and then questionnaires about sleep and quality of life. And so we just started collecting data on this now. So I kind of wanted to give you an idea of what it might look like or how we look to use it from a study that we we've done in multiple sclerosis. And so here is data from 60 individuals at a single time point, so over 2 weeks. It averages their daily activity in a minute-to-minute time period over 24 hours. And what you can see is there's some nighttime activity, so this is at like the beginning of midnight, then this would be overnight, and here's the early morning hours as you start to get ready for work, and then this is your overall daytime activity, and then again, as the evening goes on and people get ready for bed. And what you can kind of see is that there's a really wide spread of activity. This is individuals they're able to walk, but they have a wide range of disability. And so what we're interested in knowing is like what features of their symptoms are impacting this overall activity. And it's going to depend on what it is that is of interest. So this daily activity pattern, what we want to look at to see. So for one option might be the EDSS, which is commonly used in AMN as well to assess overall disability. So from having no disability or 0 to 1 minimal disability up through about a 7 or 6 where you can still walk, or 6.5 with a cane or a device. And we looked at this in MS and our POP group. And when we just look at overall physical activity for a day-to-day, it's what we expect, right? So people with less disability have more activity in their 24-hour period than people with more disability, but that really doesn't give us a whole lot of information about what their day-to-day activity is like. So we used some regression modeling called function on scalar regression to look at this a little bit more closely. And interesting, what we find is that the differences among the disability levels is actually in this daytime period. And most specifically between like 6 and 9 o'clock at night is when there becomes a much greater difference between people with lower disability who still have a lot of activity and people with more disability who are starting to show a decline in their activity. And this might be important for me as a therapist to say, you know, maybe this is when I want to target having you exercise more because that's when you're having less activity. Or it might be something that we use that before you come to clinic, we send you an actigraph for 2 weeks, and we are able to pick up that you're starting to show a slowing in your overall activity, and that might give us an indication that something is changing that we need to look for. And then we've looked at the same data, and we looked at it in relationship to timed walking. And so what we found here for a timed walking test, interestingly, is it's not the same as when we look at overall disability. We actually find that the differences actually occur at night more and in the early morning hours. So the people with more disability here are having less activity. They're walking slow. They walk slower. So that's the darker line, and then the lighter color. They're walking faster earlier in the day. They actually have similar overall activity. Not that we can pick up a significant difference in their daytime, but people who have more disability are actually more active overnight. And so there might be some different reasons that we think that this might be the case, that people don't have good sleep who are less active. Potentially, there's some metabolic factors that using large muscles actually initiates like your circadian rhythm to help you start to sleep at night. And so potentially people who are walking slower are just not using their large muscle groups as much during the day, and so they're not getting as good sleep at night. I mean, that's kind of just a ballpark idea, but like that's the kind of thing that we would want to be interested in knowing about for men and women with AMN, whether or not, you know, similar features impact their overall activity, and then how much activity you're able to get during the day. So I guess my thing is stay tuned and maybe sign up and come let us see how much activity you're getting so that we can see if this measure of actigraph activity is able to give us some more information about progression and disability. And so now I'm going to hand over to Dr. Smith-Fine to tell you about our other method that we're using.
Okay, so Jen focused on how we might apply accelerometry for physical activity monitoring in day-to-day life and try to understand how that impacts disability and progression in AMN. And on the flip side, I'm going to talk about a research strategy that we started using with the wearables to get information about specific performance on specific walking and balance tests and AMN during supervised research visits. So this is very similar to what she described is done in the lab for the ELO study, but with new advantages with the flexibility of the wearables. So a few things. One thing that we've already started implementing over the last year and a half or so are that these sensors are portable, they're relatively inexpensive, so we have a few units, so we can actually use them either in person in the clinic or ship them home for remote collection. And that it's an advantage because these are user-friendly for both participants at home to figure out how to set them up and also for training new research staff. They allow us to get more frequent collection of data points. As you know, you often aren't coming to the clinic more than once a year, but we can send these out every few months to the home. It helps to remove some barriers of participation. So certainly sometimes, especially with more disability, it's a burden to have to travel, out of state to a leukodystrophy center. And then obviously there's costs and time involved with that as well. So we bring the technology to you. And then the nice thing as well is rather than passive collection, which happens, for instance, with the actographs, these tests are directly supervised in real time by our research staff during about 1 hour visits. So what we used is the Opal system of wearable accelerometers. As Jen mentioned, these record movement in a real-world context. They've already been validated in several other diseases compared to that gold standard motion lab equipment that she mentioned. And they're commonly cited in other adult neurologic disorders such as MS and Parkinson's disease. And then, of course, there's the gait instability or ataxia. That's a big component in AMN. And the wearables give us, they collect lots of metrics that are familiar in the ataxia literature. So in terms of the remote data collection, and actually a little more about the system. So these are basically looks just like a Fitbit battery-based accelerometer. We use 3 of them at a time, and they sync a signal that's sent to a central sensor by ultra-low power radio frequency waves. As I mentioned, there are 3 that go on the waist and the feet for a series of tests. And actually for the home visits, we send the Opals kit here, a web camera that's remote controlled to give us some flexibility with the space, a laptop, and a user-friendly device manual. And so I took some screenshots from a lovely video that our coordinators and nurse practitioner made. That demonstrates exactly how to set everything up in your home, how to place the Opals on, connect everything, and then how to prepare the space in your home to actually do the tests. Okay. So basically the walking test is, so the 6-minute walk test you might be familiar with in clinic that requires, well, a lot of energy and also a very long walkway. So we shortened that to a 2-minute walk test. It just requires about 20 feet of space. We do a couple trials. And so the nice thing about the Opals is they collect about 16 different variables during the gait cycle. So that's the period from the foot first touching down, usually heel strike, to when it touches down again. And so it lets us know things like how fast the walking speed is, how long the stride lengths are, how much the foot is lifting off the ground or swinging out to the side, lots of great information of that nature. And then for the sway, so Jen sort of thoroughly talked about the different postural sway conditions. So we're using the same, and we variably challenge participants by asking to close the eyes or to put the feet together to make that more challenging. And so the Opals will get, so this is the waist sensor, and it allows us to understand how much sway there is, front to back, side to side, and what's sort of the jerkiness or the wobbliness of the sway, and also what the extent or how much ground people are covering as they're swaying. So all this is important details. Okay, so here's a quick demo. I think it shouldn't have sound, so I can talk over it again, that our coordinators made to show people how to walk through these. And so this is just the 2-minute walk test. So just back and forth between a couple points. You just need to have a smooth walkway, hands at the sides. And then for the sway tests, we're just going to demonstrate one of those conditions, but there's a force plate that you're given so that the stance width is the same for each person, and across the testing time points, arms are at the hips, and pretty much it's just standing still for 30 seconds. And we do 2 trials of each condition. Okay. All right. So before I talk, I'm just going to take two slides to discuss our first basically experience trying to do gait and balance testing remotely with patients. And this was in another leukodystrophy that has a lot of parallels with AMN called LBSL, or leukoencephalopathy with brainstem and spinal cord involvement and lactate elevation. So we've been using the Opal system for a few years now. We published cross-sectional study results just in April this year, and we're still doing longitudinal data collection there. So just a bit about LBSL and similarities to AMN. Well, I guess, first of all, there's a different pathophysiology involved. This is more of a mitochondrial leukodystrophy. There's mutations in DARS2 that affect an enzyme that's important for mitochondrial protein translation. In the brain, so in LBSL, there's white matter changes in the cerebellum, the cerebral white matter, and then similar to an AMN, throughout the dorsal columns and the corticospinal tracts often as well. So they also have the same sort of sensory proprioceptive issues and ataxia with walking. And then clinically, there can be onset of LBSL anytime throughout the life span. Disability obviously accumulates into adulthood, so that also most patients will need an aid to walk or a wheelchair eventually. And again, they suffer from a lot of the same issues: the gait unsteadiness, the spasticity or tightness in the muscles, and the sensory problems. Okay, so just briefly, for the paper that we published in April, there were 3 key findings. Well, first of all, we were able to demonstrate that it is feasible to obtain this critically important gait and balance information remotely at home. And then for the first figure, our group of LBSL patients showed a significant gait variability compared to controls with something called the lateral step variability, which sort of measures how much change there is from the normal expected gait pattern. Also, just looking at the sway area overall, so this is those same 4 conditions we've been talking about, and what we found in LBSL is that in the 2 conditions where the eyes were closed, there was a significant amount of sway, especially compared to control. So this is, again, giving us some evidence that it's picking up the dorsal column dysfunction, the sensory issues that they have. And then finally, we looked at correlations with a recognized clinical ataxia scale called the SARA, and saw that both the lateral step variability and the sway area correlated very strongly with that scale. So hopefully it's clinically useful and meaningful information. Okay. So the second objective, to follow up where Jen started, is to look at how performance during walking and balance tests relates to severity and progression of disability in AMN and ultimately quality of life. So the method is similar, and this is really, it's the same study where we're sending the actographs, but this is a longitudinal study over the next few years involving both men and women. One requirement is that the EDSS be less than 7, so at least walking with an aid, and we're actually still actively recruiting for this study. And so we test the walking and balance every 6 months over a few years, so it's alternating. Basically, the clinic visits are every year, the Opal's visits at home are every year, so we get collection every 6 months. And then we're doing those tests, the walk test and the sway test that I mentioned. Okay, so I'll just do a brief overview of what we found to date and like a modest sample of patients cross-sectionally. So I'll go through the age and the EDSS score distributions of our men and women that have participated, and then run through some data from running multiple linear regression models, is essentially looking at trying to see how the walking and the sway variables correlate with the disability score, but accounting for age, because that can also impact the disability score. And so it's the same test that we mentioned. And I'm going to show data from the entire ALD group. Since there's 23 people, which is a modest size, but as our numbers accumulate, we'll definitely plan on separating the analyses for men and women because we suspect that there's going to be some phenotypic differences there that will be important to capture over time and address. Okay, so just in terms of the distribution, so ages first. Oh, good, you are seeing this, the little arrow here. So the women are in, so for convention going forward for the next few slides are that women are in red and men are in blue. The women, it's kind of a nice normal bell-shaped curve. The range is from 20s to 70s of our participants, with sort of most being here in middle age, and then really most sort of in their 40s to 60s. And then the men, conversely, are a little bit skewed to be younger, anywhere from 20s to 50s, but mostly in 20s to 30s. And this is like not unexpected. Of course, we know that, first of all, women will often present with symptoms to the clinic a little later, and often also present when there are sons or male relatives that are younger that present with symptoms. So this is sort of a common pattern that we see. And then for the EDSS score, we did have a nice representation of EDSS scores for both the men and the women. The scores from the men, pretty much we had a couple people from all of these ranges. For women, most of the scores were between a 0 and a 4. And remember again that less than 6.5 is walking with an 8. Okay. So, so first, I just want to show some of our gait variables that we found that that correlate significantly with the EDSS score after accounting for age. So I'll show these three, and so by far the strongest correlation we found was between the toe-off angle and the EDSS score. So this, I don't think we've talked about this at all this talk. So the toe-off angle is basically the angle of the foot as it's leaving the floor at push-off. So these are factors that might influence push-off or weakness and spasticity that might impair the ability to do that with your foot to initiate a stride. And so for reference, the pitch when the foot is flat is 0 or 0 degrees, and that's closer to like a foot drop situation. So the toe-off angle, so basically having a smaller value or a smaller number of degrees indicates more impairment with the push-off. And so we did see that the toe-off angle decreases steadily as the EDSS score increases. We also found kind of basically just a modest or moderate correlation of the turning angle during walking with the EDSS. So I mentioned things about the stride, but it also gets information about how fast you're turning, what the angle of turning is, how many steps you take in turning. That also lets us know about instability there. And so so this was significant, but just not as strong of a correlation. And then the gait speed, so everybody, that's also an important measure. And again, this is not the 6-minute walk test, so it's not asking people to walk as fast as possible, but just whatever is their casual, comfortable pace. But still, we saw that during the 2 minutes, the speed of gait decreases as the EDSS score increases. And for reference here, hopefully you can see this with the resolution, but there's normal gait speed does vary across the age and adulthood, but it should be really at least 1 meters per second across the age groups. All right, so the next thing is the next couple slides will talk about the sway variables that we found that correlate with the EDSS score. So the sway amplitude, this is extent of postural sway. It's sort of really our best approximation of what the force plates give us. So we did find that is correlated significantly with the EDSS actually across all 4 of those conditions. So feet apart, eyes open, feet apart, eyes closed, feet together, eyes open, and feet together, eyes closed. But we see really the best strength of correlation was in the feet apart, eyes closed, which again, not too surprising. In clinic, this is called the Romberg. Jen has talked about it, but when you remove visual input, essentially because of the dorsal column changes, difficulty of understanding where your body is positioned in space, there's just sway, a greater amount of sway. And so we see this relationship with the EDSS. And then the next slide is the sway area. So this is similar. This, you could sort of think of this as the total ground that the participants are covering over that 30 seconds as they sway. And so we also found it significantly is correlated with EDSS across all of those 4 conditions, and highest when the feet are apart and the eyes are closed here. Okay. So there's been a lot of encouragement recently from the FDA to use the force plates for sway measurement. So we were pleased basically to get these findings with the wearables. This is early. We definitely need more patients to participate, but it looks like they are showing some promise as an additional, maybe more flexible measure to use in future clinical trials. And so just as an example, we are further evaluating the level of agreement or the correlation between the force plates and opals. So this is a representative, in this figure, this is just one person with AMN, and this is looking at the path length during sway as measured by the opals here on the y-axis and the force plate on the x. And so you can see, so the subject did all 4 of the conditions, 2 trials each, and so you see those dots are sort of pretty closely aligned. They're each linearly increasing as the sway challenge gets harder, and they just are very close to each other. So we were very encouraged by this. And then just to summarize, so first of all, in terms of the last few slides I showed you, looking at gait and sway regression analyses with the opal sensors, and for walking, there were significant correlations of the toe-off angle, turn angle, and the gait speed with the EDSS. And then for sway, we saw just modest correlations for the sway amplitude and area across. And as I mentioned earlier, we actually really need more men to be involved. The women are, we have twice as many women as men. So if anybody is interested, we would absolutely love to have you. And we'll separate those analyses as our enrollment increases. Okay. And then just sort of overall, Jen had sort of focused on how strength, sensation, balance, and walking are important measures that we can quantify, and that actually do give us information about progression of disability in AMN. And then, of course, there are a number of advantages we reviewed using wearables of different types to help us advance our assessment of sensory motor function and move towards trials. So immediate next steps are to increase enrollment at Kennedy Krieger. Ali Fatimi is our PI there. And then we have a couple of collaborating centers that have large cohorts of ALD patients as well. So very excited. Hopefully the next talk can incorporate all the excellent work that's being done at Amsterdam UNC, PI Mark England. So they actually have a very large group of AMN patients as well, and they started doing the 6-minute walk test. So we're going to be comparing how, at our site, we've been more focused on that self-selected pace. So how does fast as possible versus self-selected walking impact how things change over time? And then at MGH, PI Florian Eichler, they're also getting going with their opals testing. So we're expecting to be able to have a lot more power for this study soon. And then next, we're also looking at the relationship of gait and sway with patient-reported quality of life. So, you know, these numbers hopefully are important, but we sort of need to verify what does it mean for you on a day-to-day basis? How does it really impact function? And so we've been sending basically a quality of life survey about physical health out to try to understand any relationships there, and then also starting to collect information on patient-reported falling, which is just something we recognize in the clinic is a big issue. Can also sort of contribute to more downstream problems, especially if there's an injury. So just understanding, again, if any of these are related to falls and how we might even potentially have a rehab intervention to apply there. Okay. And so finally, we just got IRB approval for a new study. So it incorporates a lot of the things that Jen and I have already talked about in terms of the measurements, but there's an intervention now with an exercise program that's either geared to boost strength or balance over an 8-week period. And so then we basically do before and after measurements with these accelerometers. So again, that's up and going. It's on clinicaltrials.gov, or you can certainly ask any of us about that if there's interest. Okay. So thanks for your attention and participation today. And of course, want to thank all of our research participants and families who give us their time every 6 months to be involved in this. To my primary mentor, Ali Fatimi, as well as really a number of other individuals. Just especially wanted to thank our research coordinators, Jordan Goodman and Dan Amos, who do the yeoman's work in clinic to try to get as many of these variables done as they can and work around physicians in a busy clinic, and Bella Turk, who has contributed significantly to the analysis and sort of thinking about how we do the stats for these studies. All right, thanks very much.
I see some questions in the back. Let's see. I think Amber had her hand up.
Work, and I'm trying to picture using it to go to regulatory agency with this as an endpoint. So as you noted towards the end, you want to correlate sway with falls, but AMN being a rare disease, that may take you quite a bit of time to collect. So could we instead use just elderly and measure, it's easy to get a lot of old people, and measure how their sways correlate with falls so that then we can use that to superimpose on top of the AMN data?
I think it's been done. I'm just deciding if Jen or I should answer this question. So so this is something. Well, I'm quite certain it's going to have to be specific, unfortunately, to ALD. But I do think there's already literature support for what you mentioned, because it's very well recognized that falls are an issue in the elderly. We might be able to borrow, I guess, a little bit of the understanding from that literature to sort of know where to focus. But I don't think there's a way around it. I can say encouragingly, though, that I didn't show this data today, but what the Amsterdam group has done. So I'm really impressed. Their patients actually have responded over a year, every 2 weeks, to a questionnaire about falls, with actually a pretty good response rate. And so even with like a relatively small group of people, there's a nice signal there. In terms of correlation with a couple of the sway and walking variables. So it might not be especially if we have good consistency of responses, as difficult as it might seem. Yeah.
Anything we have a Zoom question. They are wondering how they can enroll in the study.
Oh, and someone wondering how to enroll? Okay, yeah, so I can go back one slide and certainly just let me know. I can give you this information after trying to go back one. But it's in clinicaltrials.gov. I think even if you put in clinicaltrials.gov, AMN, exercise, it'll probably come right back up. The identifier is here on the bottom if you can see it.
Thank you for including women in the study. I want to start with that. And then I apologize, I had trouble following some of the graphs. So in the 2-year study, were there any outliers? So were there patients who just kind of were a straight line, or was it every single patient who you saw a decline in?
Yeah, so it's a range of progression. We didn't do the analysis to look at like for people who maybe progress faster than others. It's as a group as a whole, and controlling for age and sex, depending on if we did we looked at the models as a whole set or individually. So there's a range of progression over the time. I can't speak to exactly how much like one person would progress in that 2-year time, if that's what you mean.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I was just wondering if there were any straight lines, if anecdotally.
So I mean, you don't pick up the change in 1 year, so that much we know. And people do kind of vary a little bit over that time period. It depends, I think I think it probably relates to the different, progression is just heterogeneous. So everyone looks a little bit different. So if you have worse, sensory loss, then you may have more progression, or you may start at a worse point already. And then we might not see so much change in the eyes closed condition as we might see in, say, the eyes open condition. So I think it basically depends.
Thank you.
Great talk and very important advances, because this, as Amber was implying, could be very useful for drug development or therapeutic development. I might have missed this, but what is the correlation between the sway result that you get with a wearable and the sway result you get in the lab with a more formal test? Is it very tight?
We don't have it yet.
You don't have it yet. Okay,
Yeah.
well, let's assume it is.
I guess you may have it in
Yeah.
LBSL. Oh no, I guess not.
Yeah, so it's a good question. We just still need to clean up and analyze the data, but we do.
Okay.
Of course, we don't have the ability when patients are remote to test both, but we do have them stand on the force plate while they're wearing the opals in clinic. So that's something coming down the pike. Yeah.
And then I guess the other question is, to what extent is the sway test itself, the formal version, reproducible from, say, day to day or week to week within the same patient? Is it really?
Yeah, like the force plates, reliability. She'll want to talk about that.
You mean with the wearables or with the
No,
force
with the formal test.
Oh, with the force plate. It hasn't been done recently, but Kathy Sikowski did it originally, and that there's a high reproducibility from one test to the next. But I don't know if we have one day to the next day. I have to check for certain on which. Yeah.
Because this then would allow the wearable approach would allow you to measure it at more frequent intervals, and that could be a better way to get, say, statistical significance in some kind of interventional trial.
Sure.
Than just measuring it every 3 or 6 months or something.
Exactly. Maybe we could get change in 18 months rather than 2 years, which would be worthwhile. Yeah.
So you've already addressed a little bit of the variability when you're dealing with human subjects, like age or time from onset. Center of mass is an issue. Men tend to have a lower center of gravity. And the issue with aging is that women's stance tends to narrow while men's tends to widen. Do you account for speed versus stride length? Is that something you look at? And how do you account for when they're remote with their wearable, gradient of walking surface? So somebody who lives in San Francisco is going to have a different outcome than somebody who lives in Minneapolis. And then also, are they keeping a journal with perceived effort and perceived fatigue? Do you notice a difference end of the day? It's a lot of questions, but when you're dealing with people, it's very hard to account for all of that. Do you address any of these things in your study?
So like the original data with the force plates, and the laboratory measures, I know this isn't exactly restarted, but we actually did record like the time when people did their testing, and we probably learned somewhat the hard way that we had to do some of the mobility things early in the day because we have like 2 days of testing for that study. And so we tried to stay with the same time of day for doing those things, for one thing. We do usually account for height differences, and then age at least accounts for some similar changes in aging over time. So you might see that, but it should have sort of, it happens to everyone, right? So, right. And then, so I let you talk about walking speed, but it is a good question. I think the problem with the walking, same thing with the remote studies, is we have them do it in the same condition every time, so we can sort of see over time the change from one team to the next. It is a little bit of a challenge because everyone's home is different, but we do need a minimum distance in order to get data, so everyone will have walked at least that much distance in order to collect the standing and the walking measures. So,
Do one more question, and then we get to move on.
Yes, the study that you described that you've been doing and want to continue doing with the Opal sensors and the actigraph watches sounds very similar to the natural history study sponsored by Swan Bio. Is there an opportunity for the research institutions like yours to partner with the industry as well? I know there's a lot of complications to that, but it does seem like you all are doing somewhat similar things at the moment.
Yeah, we hope, yes. the FDA and some of the industry partners that we worked with at Kennedy Krieger are starting to work with. They're still very focused on the force plates. I think it might take a publication or two or a little bit more work to convince that this is worthwhile with the wearables, but that's like hopefully the direction that things are going soon. But yeah, thank you for the question. And if I'm happy, I don't know your name, ma'am, but there's a couple of other questions you have that would enjoy talking at some point later about some of those things.